It was a Sunday evening, warm and thick with that kind of quiet you only get in small towns after church. We were seated around the same oak dining table that had seen 3 generations of birthdays, Christmases, and arguments, and tonight, it was fully set again, like nothing had changed, except everything had. My brother Mark sat at the head of the table, as usual now. He had the voice, the stories, the firm handshake everyone seemed to admire. He also had the big job downtown and the perfect little family. My parents beamed when he spoke, nodding along like his words were gospel. My sister Julia sat beside him, sipping wine like a queen in exile, making little remarks that sounded sweet, but always seemed to sting just a little. And then, there was me, fork in hand, chewing slow, saying less. I'd come back home after 7 years abroad, posted to conflict zones, moving from base to base, always stationed somewhere too hot or too dry. I never said much about what I did. Not because I didn't want to, but because I'd learned a long time ago that people didn't really want to know. They liked their soldiers, tidy medals, polished, stories neat, but the truth's never tidy, is it? So I sat and listened. Like I usually did. Julia was talking about her latest client win. Mark was recounting how the mayor had asked for his opinion on some zoning thing. And then Mom leaned over her plate, glanced at me with that gentle concern that always made me feel like a little boy with a scraped knee, and said, "So, are you still trying to find something to do now that you're out?" I swallowed my bite. Mark laughed, not a cruel laugh, but the kind that fills the space and makes you feel like you missed the joke. "Well, it's hard to transfer military skills into the real world." "Huh?" he said, half smirking. And then Julia, wine glass raised, added her favorite line. "Some people are just meant to follow, not lead, and that's okay." The table laughed, lightly, almost politely, and I smiled. But inside, something cracked, not because I hadn't heard it before, but because I had, too many times. The words were familiar, like old wounds reopened. I looked down at my plate. The mashed potatoes were cooling fast. I didn't speak. What could I say? That I'd patched up children torn apart by shrapnel. That I'd spent nights writing goodbye letters I never had to send. That I'd led men through storms of fire and come back with fewer each time. No, you don't say those things at Sunday dinner. So I nodded, cut my meat, and kept quiet. Later that night, I stepped out to the porch. The old swing was still there, creaking slightly in the breeze. I sat down, staring out at the stars. The sound of crickets filled the silence. My thoughts wandered, back to the desert, where the heat was so strong you couldn't tell if you were sweating or just evaporating. I remembered Samir, the translator who risked his life to save ours, and Corporal Ellis, who never made it to 24. I remembered the medals tucked away in a shoebox, collecting dust because I'd never felt proud enough to hang them, and I remembered the weight of command, not the glory, but the decisions, the silence after an order, the knowledge that your voice could mean life or death. That kind of weight stays with you, but it's invisible to others, especially around a dinner table. I left early the next morning, didn't say much, just nodded, packed my bag, and went. I wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of being seen like a blank space in the family picture, a placeholder, a name they call when they need to tell stories about our boy in the army, but not someone they truly understood. It wasn't always like this. When I was younger, my dad used to drive me to the recruiter's office himself. He was proud then. Said service ran in our blood. But after my 3rd deployment, he started asking when I was going to settle down and get a real life. Funny how people change their pride into pity when they don't understand the path you chose. A week later, I got an invitation. It was from the base commander, a recognition ceremony. Nothing flashy, just a quiet thank you. I almost didn't go, but something in me, something small and stubborn, said yes. I arrived in uniform, polished boots, pressed jacket. The air was crisp. Fall had just begun, and the wind carried the scent of pine and dry leaves. The ceremony was simple, a few speeches, some handshakes. But when my name was called, and I stepped forward, I saw him, General Matthews. I had only met him once, during an operation briefing years ago. I didn't think he'd remember me, but he did. As I approached, he stood straight, looked me in the eye, and gave a full salute. A full salute. Not a nod, not a handshake, not a pat on the back. And then he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "This man saved lives." He didn't just follow orders, he carried them, and he carried us. The whole room stood still. That's when I felt it, not pride, not revenge, just peace. Like all the silence I'd carried had finally found a voice. I didn't tell my family, not right away. I drove home after the ceremony, stopped by the lake where I used to fish as a boy, sat there till sunset, watched the light dance on the water like it was trying to say something in a language only the still could understand. And I realized something. I wasn't the failure. They just didn't know what I'd survived. Have you ever sat at a table and felt invisible, like your whole story didn't fit their version of who you were supposed to be? What did you do in that moment? Did you stay silent? Or did you speak? Please share your story below. I'd love to know I'm not alone. A few weeks passed. Life resumed, slowly, like it always does. The days folded into each other, mornings with quiet coffee, afternoons filled with job applications I didn't care about, and nights that stretched on longer than they should have. I wasn't looking for validation. I wasn't chasing approval. But something had shifted inside me since that salute. It was the first time in years I'd felt seen. Funny thing is, it wasn't the medals or the titles that made me feel it. It was the silence that followed the general's words. That kind of silence you can hear ringing in your chest. I kept replaying it, not because I needed the praise, but because I wanted to remember that it happened. One morning, the phone rang. It was Mom. Her voice was a little softer than usual. "Sweetheart, are you coming to Grandpa's birthday lunch next Sunday?" I hesitated. That house, that table. I could already hear the jokes before they came. The gentle jabs, the polite chuckles, the way they'd glance past me like I was a reflection on glass. Still, I said yes. Not because I wanted to, but because I had something to say, or maybe not say exactly, but show. That Sunday, I took my time getting dressed, not the usual button-down and jeans. No, this time, I wore my service uniform. I hadn't worn it outside of military events in years. It felt strange at first, the stiff collar, the polished insignia, the sharp crease of the trousers. But once it was on, I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't see a man trying to fit in. I saw who I really was. When I stepped through the front door, the house smelled like roast beef and old wood. The sound of laughter came from the dining room. They were already seated. My father looked up first. Then Julia, mid-sip, froze with her wineglass in hand. Mark raised an eyebrow. No one said a word. And I stood there, not like a soldier reporting for duty, but like a man simply stepping into his truth. Grandpa was the first to speak. "You wore the right suit today, son." His voice cut through the silence with its usual gravelly warmth. I smiled and sat down beside him. He had served to Korea, had the limp and the medals to prove it. He didn't talk much about it either. Maybe because he knew, like I did, that war wasn't something you tell. It was something you carried. We ate. The usual tension hung above the food like steam from the mashed potatoes. Then Mom said, cautiously, "You look very official today." I nodded. Just came from the base. No one asked why. No one asked what happened. But something shifted. Maybe not in their words, but in the way their eyes moved when they looked at me slower, more curious. Julia didn't make her usual remarks. Mark stayed quiet. Dad glanced at my medals once, then quickly away. I didn't need their admiration. What I needed was for them to pause, to stop treating my silence like failure and my calm like weakness. After dessert, Grandpa leaned in close and whispered, "You don't owe them your stories. You just owe yourself the truth." And I understood. That truth isn't something you prove. It's something you wear whether they notice or not. That night, back home, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea. The metal case was on the table. I hadn't opened it since the ceremony. I lifted the lid and traced my fingers over the ribbons, the insignias, the names engraved on cold metal. Not all of them were mine. Some had been handed down. Others had been awarded posthumously. One belonged to Ellis. His mother had given it to me at his funeral. "He followed you to the end," she'd said. There were no words for that kind of weight, so I carried it in silence. A week later, a letter arrived. Handwritten, thick envelope, from General Matthews. Inside was a simple note. "Men like you carry the burdens others can't see. That doesn't make you invisible. It makes you essential. Let that be your strength. M." I read it twice, then I folded it neatly and placed it next to the medals. Not for show, for remembrance. I started volunteering not long after that, at a local youth center, helping kids who had fathers like mine, silent, distant, demanding, or none at all. Some were angry, some just lost. But when they talked, I listened. Not because I had answers, but because I knew what it felt like to speak into silence and get nothing back. One boy, Noah, reminded me of myself, 12 years old, always looking down. Said his dad told him he'd never be strong enough to lead. I knelt beside him once after practice and said, "You know what? Real strength is carrying something heavy quietly because no one else can." He didn't say anything, just nodded. That was enough. I never did go back to working in an office. I didn't need the suit or the title. I found my place, finally, in moments of quiet connection where words weren't loud, but true. And every time someone asked me what I did, I didn't say former military anymore. I said I help people carry what they've been told they should hide, and that always made them pause. Just long enough to look again. The thing about family is, they rarely change their minds out loud. You might get a glance that lasts a second longer than usual, or a question that finally feels genuine. But most of the time, when people shift, it's silent, invisible. That's what started happening after the lunch at Grandpa's. Small things. Julia sent me a message out of nowhere, just a photo of us as kids in the garden. I hadn't seen that picture in decades. We were muddy and wild, wrestling over a hose. She didn't write anything with it, but I could feel the softness behind it. Mom started checking in more. Little things, recipes she thought I might want, updates on her plants. I knew her way she wasn't great with big apologies, but she tried in her own quiet ways. Even Dad. Well, he didn't say anything, but when I visited a month later, I noticed something strange. My medals, the ones I'd tucked away in a box for years, were now framed, clean, displayed in the corner of their hallway. Not front and center, not in the living room. Just quietly placed, like a bookmark in a story they'd never finished reading. I stood in front of that frame longer than I should have. I didn't cry, but I felt something loosen in my chest. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was movement. Still, There were shadows that stayed. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night and forget where I was. The silence after certain dreams felt heavier than any gunfire I'd ever heard. There were days I didn't want to talk to anyone, not because I was angry, but because I was full. Full of memories that had no words. Full of faces I still remembered more clearly than my own. One day, I drove to the coast, just got in the car and left. No destination, just needed the ocean, the openness, the way the waves don't ask anything of you. I walked the shoreline for hours, watched the sun set like it was trying to melt into the sea. And that's when I realized something. For so long, I thought I was broken because my family didn't see me, but maybe they never could. Not fully. And that wasn't my failure. It wasn't theirs. Either. It just was. That's the hard part about healing. It doesn't come from someone saying, "I'm sorry." It comes when you stop waiting for them to. It comes when you learn to bless your own story, even the parts no one else applauds. There was a moment, about 6 months after that dinner, that really stayed with me. I was at a small community event just helping set up chairs for a veterans talk. Nothing fancy, just folding metal chairs and plastic cups of lemonade. A man I didn't recognize approached me. Older, about my dad's age, dressed in a faded baseball cap and windbreaker. He said, "Are you the one who helped Ellis's unit out in Damas?" I paused, nodded. His eyes got red, voice cracked. "I'm his uncle. His mom talks about you like your family. She says you brought her peace." I didn't know what to say. We just stood there, two strangers, bound by someone we both lost. Then he reached into his coat pocket and handed me something. A patch. It had Ellis's initials stitched into the side. "She wanted you to have this." I held it in my palm. The fabric was worn, but the stitching was strong, just like Ellis. I held that patch for a long time after he left. Didn't tuck it away. Just held it. Sometimes, the people who see you really see you aren't the ones who've known you the longest. Sometimes, they're the ones who've known your silence. One evening, I went back to that same dining table. My parents invited me over. No occasion, just dinner. I almost said no, but then I thought no. Let's see what this becomes. Mark wasn't there this time. Julia came late. Grandpa had passed a few weeks earlier, and I could still feel the absence in the walls. We ate quietly. Then, mid-meal, my father cleared his throat. "Son," he said, not looking at me directly, "your mother and I were wondering if you'd speak at the town's Veterans Day ceremony." I blinked. He added, "They asked me, but I told them I didn't serve. But you should tell them something, anything." I nodded, slowly, not because I'd been waiting for that, but because, somehow, I wasn't anymore. The day of the speech, the town square was full. Nothing big, just folding chairs, a few flags, and families with tired toddlers and strollers. I wore my uniform again, stood at the podium, looked out at the crowd, and I didn't speak about medals. I didn't speak about war. I spoke about weight, about how every person carries something that others can't see, about how sometimes you survive things and come home looking the same, but you're not, about how the quietest person at the table might be the one who's held the most. I ended by saying this: don't wait to understand someone before you honor them. Sometimes, honoring them is how you begin to understand. There was a pause. After that, a stillness. Then, gentle clapping. And in the front row, I saw my mom, hands together, eyes glassy. My dad didn't clap right away, but he stood, straight, still, like a man who might not know how to apologize, but knew when he'd been wrong. People often ask me, "How did you forgive them?" And I always answer the same way I didn't. Not really, because it's not always about forgiveness. Sometimes it's about releasing, letting go of the story you told yourself, the one where they have to understand, have to make it right, have to give you what you never got. When I stood on that podium and saw the faces watching me, some I knew, most I didn't, I realized something simple but heavy. I didn't need my family to rewrite the past. I just needed them to stop pretending it hadn't happened. And in a way, they did. In the quiet ways people show you they're trying. A question asked gently, a pause before a joke, a seat left open beside you. It wasn't the grand apology I once dreamed of, but it was human, and that was enough. A few days after the ceremony, I got a call from Julia. She didn't say hi, just jumped right in. You know, I used to be jealous of you. I almost dropped the phone. She went on, voice soft, but not embarrassed. You always seemed so sure, even when we were kids. I thought, I don't know. I thought if I made fun of you, it'd make me feel stronger. I didn't interrupt. She continued. You know, that night I called you a follower. I went home and cried. I just couldn't admit I was the one who never had the courage to follow anything. I didn't know what to say. So I just said, thanks for telling me. It wasn't a fix. It didn't undo the years. But it was something. A thread. Maybe. Something we could both hold on to. That same week, I took a trip to Ellis's grave. It was 2 hours outside town, up a hill that made your knees ache and your breath thin. I hadn't been in years. I brought flowers, and the patch his uncle gave me. I didn't say much, just stood there, fingers in my pockets, wind scraping through the trees. Then I whispered, they're starting to see me. Ellis. Not all of them, but enough. I imagined him smirking, the way he used to when I told him something serious. He'd say, took them long enough. Cap. And we'd both laugh. Even in memory. I still hear that laugh. Back in town, something strange started happening. People began asking me to speak, not just at veteran events, but schools, town hall meetings, even Sunday service once. At first, I thought they had the wrong person, but I said yes. And every time I spoke, I noticed the same thing. People weren't listening for war stories. They were listening for truth. Not loud, patriotic truth, but quiet, everyday, worn-in truth. The kind that tells you it's okay to not be okay. The kind that reminds you strength doesn't always wear boots. That sometimes it wears a cracked voice, or tired eyes, or silence. One afternoon, I got a letter from a high school girl who'd heard me speak. It read, my dad's a vet. He never talks. We always thought he just didn't like us. But after hearing you, I realized maybe he's just tired of being misunderstood. I sat with him yesterday, didn't ask anything, just sat. He cried. First time in my life. Thank you. I read that letter 3 times, and then I cried too, because that's what we're really doing, all of us trying to make it through. We're waiting for someone to sit with us in the silence. Not long after, I started a small group at the community center. Not therapy, not counseling, just coffee, chairs, and room to speak. At first it was just a few folks, then a dozen, then more. Some were veterans. Others were just people who'd been told their pain wasn't big enough to matter. And every week, we just talked. Sometimes about grief. Sometimes about guilt. Sometimes about how strange it feels to laugh again after years of not knowing how. And we never fixed each other. We just held space. And that was enough. One evening, Dad showed up. Didn't say anything. Just walked in. Sat down. And listened. I didn't introduce him, didn't even make eye contact. But when the session ended, and folks were packing up, he walked over, eyes a little red, shoulders a little lower. He looked at me and said I should have asked sooner. Then he nodded once, like a man learning a new language. And I nodded back, like a son who'd stopped waiting. Healing isn't a straight road. It's a circle, a spiral, a back and forth. You think you're done, and then something small, a smell, a song, a sentence drags you back. But each time, you return a little stronger, a little softer, a little more yourself. These days, when someone asks me who I am, I don't say veteran first. I say I'm someone who learned to carry pain without letting it become my identity. And when I sit at a dinner table now, even with strangers, I don't shrink anymore. I take up space, not loudly, but solidly, because I've earned it. A few winters later, I got invited to a reunion. Not military, not family, just high school. I hadn't been to one in over 20 years. I almost laughed when I got the invitation white envelope. Gold letters. Class of '99 reunion. For a moment, I imagined walking in and hearing the same tired questions. So, what have you been up to? Still in the army? Ever shoot anyone? People ask those things like they're flipping through a comic book, no idea what it means to live inside one. But I went. Not for them. For me. To see if the old ghosts still had power. The reunion was held in the same gym we'd once had dances in. It smelled of floor wax and faded trophies. People were older, of course, grayer, softer. Some recognized me right away. Others stared, struggling to place the face that no longer matched the yearbook. And then I heard it. Hey, there's the guy who disappeared. I turned to see Kyle Jenkins, class president, quarterback, life of the party. Still loud, still charming. He clapped me on the back like we were best friends. You went military. Right, man. We thought you were going to end up in jail or something. You were so quiet back then. I smiled. Let it pass. He meant no harm, but the echo of those old assumptions rang louder than he knew. We took a photo, chatted, the usual, but I found myself drifting toward the edges of the room, watching, not withdrawn, just present in my own way. That's when I saw her, Ms. Leonard, our old history teacher, hair whiter now, but same gentle face. She smiled when she saw me. I always knew you'd be something solid, she said. I laughed. That's not what the others thought. She shook her head. I didn't mean flashy. I meant grounded, rooted, the kind of person who doesn't break when storms come. And for the first time that night, I let her words in, really in, because maybe that's what I'd become. Not famous, not rich, but rooted. And that matters more than people think. After the reunion, I sat in my truck for a long time before driving home. No music, just headlights on the empty road and the quiet hum of memory. That night, I didn't feel angry at the people who misunderstood me. I felt grateful, because their doubts had forced me to define myself on my own terms. They gave me the gift of becoming, not because they believed in me, but because they didn't. A few months later, I got news that Grandpa's house was finally being sold. He'd left it to the family, but no one wanted the upkeep. Too old, too drafty, too full of ghosts. I asked if I could visit one last time. The house was empty when I arrived. Furniture gone, curtains drawn, dust floating in the air like memory. I wandered from room to room, each one a chapter. The den where he'd taught me chess. The hallway where I used to tiptoe past bedtime. The kitchen that always smelled like tobacco and cinnamon. In the living room, I found a small box tucked behind the radiator. It was his. Inside were old letters, newspaper clippings, and to my surprise, one of my earliest photos in uniform. On the back, he'd written in shaky script, he didn't just serve his country. He served with honor. I sat on the bare floor, holding that picture, and I cried. For the boy who had always wanted to be seen, for the man who no longer needed it to survive, and for the grandfather who had always seen me in ways I hadn't known. I kept the photo, framed it in my house, not for visitors, not for approval, but for me. For the days when old voices whispered again, the ones that say you're still not enough, that photo became my answer. Now, every Sunday, I host a small dinner at my place. Just a few people, no big feast, just soup, bread, and space to speak. Veterans, widows, teenagers trying to figure out who they are, neighbors with no family nearby. We sit, we eat, we share, and sometimes we just sit. Because not every story needs words. Some need only presence. One evening, after everyone left, I stood by the sink, washing dishes. I looked at the empty plates and thought about that long-ago Sunday dinner, the one where they called me a failure, the one that hurt more than any battlefield. And I smiled, because now I understood they didn't define me, and they never had. They only helped shape the silence I eventually filled with my own voice. It's funny how the most important changes in life happen without applause. No fireworks, no announcements, just a quiet click inside you, like a door finally shutting behind the past. That's what happened a year after that first dinner. I was back at my parents' house for another family gathering, this time for Mom's birthday. The dining table looked the same, polished and set with the good plates. Mark was there with his daughter. Julia too, now more reserved. Dad still wore that old cardigan he never washed properly, but I was different, not because they said so. They still didn't really talk about the military, still didn't ask about what I did, where I went, or what it cost me. But they watched me differently, like they no longer saw someone unfinished, like they no longer needed to fit me into a neat little box with a label they could understand. It was a small shift, but it was real. After dinner, Mark's daughter came up to me. She was maybe 10, 11. Big eyes, shy voice. "Uncle," she asked, tugging my sleeve. "Yes." She looked at me for a moment, then said, "Are you a hero?" I didn't know what to say, so I knelt down, smiled, and replied, "No. But I served beside many who were." She nodded slowly, like she was filing that answer away. Then she hugged me, just once, quick and tight. And that was it. The simplest moment of the night, but one I carried home like a medal no one could ever pin to my chest. Later that week, I sat down with Dad on the porch. He was holding a glass of iced tea, watching the sky shift to dusk. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "I didn't know how to talk to you after you came back." Didn't know what to say. I guess I was scared I'd say the wrong thing. That was the closest he ever came to an apology, and it was enough. I nodded and said, "It's okay. Dad, I didn't know how to talk either." And that was the truth. Somewhere along the way, I stopped needing to be understood by everyone. I stopped chasing explanations. And in that space, I began to live again. Not as a veteran, not as the quiet son, not even as the man they called a failure, but as someone who survived, someone who could still laugh, still cry, still love, and who didn't need permission to feel any of it. A few months ago, I gave a talk at a local college. It wasn't about war. It wasn't even about family. It was about resilience. I told the students something I'd learned the hard way. People will try to define you by the loudest moment of your life, your biggest success, or your worst mistake. But you are not your headlines. You are the quiet mornings you choose to rise again. You are the strength it takes to forgive someone who never says sorry. You are the decision to keep going even when no one's clapping. After the talk, a young man came up to me, looked nervous. He said, "I haven't spoken to my father in 3 years. He never believed in me. I dropped out of college, joined the reserves. I thought I failed him." I looked at him and said gently, "Maybe, but maybe you're just becoming someone he hasn't learned how to recognize yet." His eyes welled up. "Thanks, sir." I shook his hand, and I knew right then this is what healing looks like. Not fixing, but passing it on. The last letter I got from General Matthews came shortly before he retired. It was short, just a few lines. "Some men lead with force, some lead with presence. You led with weight. That's what stays." He signed it with a single word. Respectfully. I framed that letter, not because I needed the proof, but because every now and then, we all need to remember the truth, especially when it's been doubted, buried, or ignored for too long. Today, my home is quiet. No awards on the wall, no flags in the yard, just a room with a window facing east. And every morning, when the light comes in, I sit with my coffee and remind myself they called me a failure at dinner. But they didn't know what I carried. They didn't know what I chose not to say. And they didn't know that one day, a general would salute me not because I was loud, but because I endured. You may not always get the applause. You may not always hear the apology. But if you keep walking, if you carry the weight with grace, someone, somewhere, will see it. Even if it's just you. And sometimes, that's all that matters. Have you ever felt unseen? Unheard even by the people closest to you? What helped you find your strength again? I hope you'll share that story, not for sympathy, but for someone who might still be searching for theirs.